The final element that relates to your actual negotiation deals with the psychological tools that you can use and the traps that you want to avoid. And during the course, we talked about 9 of these tools and traps. The first one, mythical fixed pie assumption, was the assumption that our interests conflict with the interests of the other side. This is perhaps the most important element that relates to the house on Elm Street, and I'm going to save it until the end. So let's go through some of the other ones. First, anchoring. As we defined it earlier, we tend to anchor on an initial value when trying to evaluate an item that has an uncertain value. So question here, the big question with anchoring is who should throw out the first price? And how did you deal with that question here? During your negotiation, think back, did you throw out the first price or did the other side throw out the first price? Think of the advice we talked about when talking about anchoring. The fundamental conclusion was, when you're dealing with an item that has an uncertain value, let the other side throw out the first price because that's a way for you to gather information about that value. Whereas if you're fairly confident of the value, then you throw out the first price and try to anchor them to your price. So what's our situation here? Certain value, uncertain value. In my opinion, this is a case involving property with a very uncertain value because I gave you very few facts about the value of the house. You know what the tax assessment is, you know the value of a house that was sold 6 years ago, but apart from that, very uncertain value. So if I were the negotiator here, I would try to get the other side to throw out the first price. And I noticed over the years that the people in this negotiation who do throw out the first price often get destroyed. So you have a situation where, for example, the buyer will walk into the negotiation thinking, well, I'm probably going to have to pay around $200,000 for this house. And then the seller throws out the first price, which might be, let's say, $170,000. And right away, the buyer is $30,000 ahead of what they thought the price would be. And immediately, the great negotiators immediately recalibrate and they act very sad. They act very upset by that price of $170,000 and try to negotiate it down further. The negotiators who aren't as good might accept that offer of $170,000 right away. Now, if you're the seller here and you throw out the first price of $170,000 and the other side accepts immediately, are you happy about that? Probably most of us would be very upset with that because we suddenly realize, hey, we picked a price that was much too low. They accepted it too quickly. I should have selected another price. So if you ever want to make somebody upset in a negotiation, accept their offer immediately. Even when they're making a great offer, you'll make them feel better if it's a bit of a struggle and if you negotiate over what they're offering. So those are the considerations regarding anchoring and first price. Overconfidence is not a huge issue in this case, but let me give you an illustration of how it might come into play. If I had asked you, let's say you're Tracy here, the seller. If I had asked you to estimate the ZOPA, the zone of potential agreement, before you started the negotiation, what would your range be in estimating that ZOPA? My guess is that very few of you would have selected a range as large as $150,000 to $250,000. Most people would select a much narrower range, which illustrates overconfidence. But if you were able to overcome overconfidence and select a larger ZOPA, then it expands your thinking about the case. If you realized, for instance, that the buyer would be willing to pay as much as $250,000, then you begin to think, well, what's behind this buyer? What is the buyer interested in? And then all of a sudden you start to look at the facts a little bit differently. You realize, well, wait a minute, no sales in this neighborhood for 6 years. And now all of a sudden, house behind me has just sold. Somebody is negotiating to buy the house next to that. And now somebody is negotiating to buy my property. Looks like these aren't individuals. Looks like it's a company trying to assemble land. And then, of course, you ratchet up your price. So overconfidence can have an impact on the success of a negotiation. Framing. Another issue that looks like it's not directly related to this negotiation. It's hard to imagine how you could frame choices that might affect decisions. We'll turn to the remaining psychological tools and traps in our next segment.